In the bitter, fog-choked winter of 1720, the wealthiest empire on earth woke up to find its vast fortunes had simply vanished into thin air. The bustling, noisy streets of London, particularly the usually frantic trading centers along Exchange Alley and Lombard Street, fell into a sudden, terrifying silence as a devastating wave of absolute financial ruin washed over the British capital. Grand aristocratic estates were abruptly abandoned, leaving once powerful members of Parliament completely destitute and wandering the cobblestones in a state of absolute shock. Ordinary families, widows, and rural clergy, who had risked their meager life savings on a hollow promise of endless wealth, now faced the brutal, freezing reality of the notorious Fleet debtors' prison, while hushed whispers of sudden suicide echoed through the dark alleyways of the city. This devastating societal collapse was not an act of war, a foreign invasion, or a natural disaster leveling the city, but the catastrophic result of a single, invisible financial contagion. In a matter of weeks, an estimated £50 million of wealth evaporated from the British economy, leaving behind a trail of shattered livelihoods without a single shot being fired or a single building burning to the ground. The chilling historical mystery that remains is exactly how an entire, highly educated nation willingly walked into such a massive, empty illusion. From the poorest Thames dock workers scraping by on mere pennies to the absolute brightest minds of the scientific age, including the legendary physicist Sir Isaac Newton, who personally lost £20,000, everyone was completely captivated by a shared, blinding greed. They called it the South Sea Bubble, but to dismiss it as a simple financial mistake ignores the calculated mechanics of the disaster. It was a perfectly designed, state-sponsored psychological trap, a masterclass in institutional deception that systematically preyed on human hope, manipulated the fundamental laws of supply and demand, and systematically destroyed countless lives between the euphoric summer and the freezing winter of 1720. To understand the dark, systemic motive behind this grand deception, we must look back at a British government pushed to the absolute brink of insolvency. For decades, the Crown had bled its treasury dry fighting endless, exhausting conflicts across the globe, most notably the grueling War of the Spanish Succession, accumulating a staggering mountain of national debt exceeding £30 million that it could never realistically hope to repay. The terrifying reality of imminent national bankruptcy loomed over the royal courts of King George I like a suffocating shadow. If the British Empire defaulted on its mounting loans, the powerful Royal Navy would go unpaid and collapse, international trade routes would instantly freeze, domestic credit would evaporate entirely, and the politically fragile country would be rapidly plunged into total, uncontrollable civil chaos. Faced with this crushing prospect of absolute financial ruin, the most powerful political leaders and financial ministers of the empire grew desperate enough to try something entirely unprecedented. Instead of raising deeply unpopular taxes or negotiating with traditional conservative banking institutions like the Bank of England, the state decided to gamble the entire economic future of the nation on a highly experimental privatization scheme. Behind the heavy, locked wooden doors of Parliament, corrupt politicians and wealthy London merchants struck a dark, secretive deal designed to temporarily save the crown. In the year 1711, under the guidance of Lord Treasurer Robert Harley, they engineered a chilling, highly coordinated legislative solution, giving birth to a brand new, privately owned and politically connected corporate entity officially known as the South Sea Company. The British government offered this unproven joint stock company an absolutely irresistible prize: a total, exclusive monopoly on all trade in the exotic, resource-rich and heavily guarded Spanish ports of South America. In exchange for this golden ticket to supposed limitless colonial riches, the ambitious directors of the South Sea Company formally agreed to take over the crushing, multi-million-pound burden of Britain's massive, unmanageable national debt. The grand promise sold to the British public was a total monopoly on trade in the legendary South Seas. The company painted pictures of endless ships returning heavily laden with gold, silver, and exotic goods from South America. It was a vision of limitless wealth that captured the imagination of a desperate nation. But buried beneath these glittering promises was a chilling, undeniable truth, because the South Seas were entirely controlled by the Spanish Empire. Spain was Britain's fierce and bitter enemy, and they had absolutely no intention of allowing British ships into their heavily guarded ports. The glorious trade monopoly that formed the very foundation of the South Sea Company was a hollow shell. At best, the company was allowed to send a single ship a year to trade, which was barely enough to cover the cost of the voyage itself. The entire enterprise was built on a deliberate, calculated fiction. With their core business model existing as a worthless illusion, the company directors had to invent a new way to keep the money flowing, turning their sights directly on the wallets of the British people. The trap they laid was as brilliant as it was devastating. The company approached ordinary citizens who held government IOUs, people who had loaned their hard-earned money to the state in exchange for a slow, safe return over many years. The directors offered these citizens a seemingly irresistible deal to trade their secure government debt for shiny new shares in the South Sea Company. They promised that the value of these shares would skyrocket, transforming modest savings into sudden, unimaginable fortunes. For this trick to work, the company needed the stock price to constantly rise, creating a powerful illusion of endless prosperity. They used the money from new investors to pay off the old ones, masking the fact that no actual profits were being made from any real trade. It was a mechanical, relentless engine of deception, feeding on the hopes of people who simply wanted a better life. The higher the stock price climbed, the more the public believed the lie. This deceptive swap created an artificial frenzy, completely detaching the stock from reality and paving the way for a dangerous new emotion to spread through the cobblestone streets of London. A terrifying contagion of greed swept across the nation, infecting everyone from the wealthiest lords to the poorest laborers. It was the primal fear of missing out, a desperate panic that neighbors and friends were getting rich while they were being left behind. People stopped thinking rationally and surrendered completely to the madness of the crowd. The quiet hum of daily life was drowned out by the frantic, desperate roar of the stock market. The human cost of this obsession was profound and immediate. Families sold their ancestral homes, farmers mortgaged their land, and elderly workers handed over their entire life savings just to buy a single share of the illusion. Taverns and coffeehouses turned into chaotic trading floors where fortunes were promised on scraps of paper. The entire country tied its survival to a bubble that was rapidly stretching to its breaking point. Yet the darkest layer of this systemic failure was the chilling reality that the very people meant to protect the public were driving the scam. The watchdogs were actively participating in the crime. To ensure their devastating debt swap was approved by the government, the directors of the South Sea Company engaged in massive, systematic bribery. They did not just bend the rules, they bought the rule-makers. Key politicians, influential lords, and even high-ranking members of the royal court were secretly handed free shares of the company. These were not investments, but guaranteed payouts designed to ensure absolute loyalty. As the stock price artificially climbed, these corrupt officials made fortunes without risking a single copper coin of their own money. The government itself became a willing accomplice in the financial slaughter of its own citizens. With the very watchdogs paid off to look the other way, the final barriers to total financial madness were completely destroyed. By the summer of 1720, the streets of London were consumed by a dizzying and terrifying fever. The price of a single share in the South Sea Company exploded to unimaginable heights, climbing from £100 to over £1,000 in just a few short months. Logic was entirely abandoned as people from every walk of life threw their life savings into the market, convinced that the numbers would simply keep rising forever. This blinding greed quickly spawned a shadow market of bizarre copycat scams. Con artists set up fake companies in dark taverns and crowded coffeehouses, selling shares for absurd ideas like extracting silver from lead or building ships against pirates. People were so desperate to get rich quick that they blindly handed over their money to these phantom businesses, creating a fragile tower of lies that stretched across the entire nation. The sheer volume of these fraudulent side schemes forced the government to step in and shut them down, inadvertently exposing the extreme fragility of the entire market. While the trusting public continued to mortgage their homes to buy more stock, a chilling turning point occurred behind closed doors. The company directors and the corrupt politicians who built the scheme looked at the hollow core of their creation and realized the massive lie could not hold. They knew that the crushing weight of the actual debt and the lack of real trade profits were about to shatter the illusion entirely. In a cold act of self-preservation, these insiders began to quietly and systematically sell off their own shares at the very peak of the market. They locked in their massive fortunes and stepped back into the shadows, leaving the everyday citizens completely unaware that the architects of the dream had already abandoned ship. The trap was set, and the victims were locked inside. The silent betrayal by the nation's most trusted leaders ensured that when the collapse finally came, The pain would fall entirely on the shoulders of the innocent. By the autumn of 1720, the terrible truth finally broke through the illusion, and the catastrophic crash happened with terrifying speed. The moment a few large investors tried to cash out and realized there was no actual money left to pay them, a blinding panic swept through the city. The blind faith that had inflated the bubble evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sudden collective terror. Everyone rushed to sell their shares all at once, but there was absolutely no one left willing to buy them. The stock price plummeted back down to earth, wiping out vast fortunes and life savings in a matter of days. The wealth that millions of people thought they had secured simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but worthless pieces of paper and crushing ruin. The agonizing realization that their futures had been stolen left an entire nation paralyzed by shock, grief, and a burning desire for answers. The immediate aftermath of the collapse in late 1720 resembled the frantic final moments of a massive heist. As the terrible reality of the empty vaults set in, the architects of the South Sea Company realized the gallows awaited them if the truth was uncovered. Inside the opulent company headquarters, the air grew thick with the smoke of a desperate cover-up. Secret ledgers, filled with the damning names of bribed politicians and fake stock transfers, were thrown into roaring fireplaces. The most critical evidence was vanishing into ash, but the conspirators knew that documents were not the only things that could speak. Robert Knight, the company's chief cashier and the man who held all the darkest secrets of the bribery scheme, packed his bags in the dead of night. Before the authorities could secure the borders, Knight vanished across the English Channel, taking the master list of corrupted officials with him and leaving a trail of furious, ruined investors in his wake. The ashes of those burned ledgers in London left a permanent void in the historical record, ensuring that many of the highest-ranking aristocrats would never face true justice. The flight of Robert Knight to France proved that the ultimate architects of this financial ruin were perfectly willing to abandon their victims to the crushing weight of poverty while they lived comfortably in exile. Down in the freezing streets of London, the illusion of sudden wealth was replaced by an epidemic of profound despair. Families who had sold their ancestral homes, merchants who had emptied their life savings, and widows who had traded their meager pensions for worthless paper now faced absolute ruin. The silence of empty pockets quickly turned into a deafening roar of public fury as thousands of broken citizens demanded blood. This was no longer just a financial crisis, but a looming threat to the very stability of the British government. Parliament was forced to launch a massive investigation, driven not by a noble pursuit of justice, but by a terrifying realization that the starving, enraged public might tear the city apart. Politicians who had secretly profited from the scam now had to publicly condemn it, scrambling to find scapegoats to satisfy the growing mob outside their doors. The desperate cry for vengeance echoed through the halls of power, forcing the government to seize the estates of the disgraced company directors just to keep the peace. The fallout from this unprecedented disaster permanently altered the legal landscape of corporate finance. To prevent another rogue corporation from ever hijacking the national economy, the government strictly enforced the Bubble Act, a piece of legislation that made it incredibly difficult to form new joint stock companies. This strict legal barrier froze the evolution of British corporate business for over a century, ensuring that the shadows of the South Sea Company would stifle economic innovation for generations. The massive toxic debt left behind by the collapsed company had to be painfully absorbed back into the Bank of England and the National Treasury, binding the British taxpayer to the cost of this monumental fraud for decades to come. But the most enduring legacy was not written in the reformed ledgers of the Bank of England, but etched into the fractured trust of the British public. The sudden plunge from unimaginable prosperity to absolute destitution broke the spirit of an entire generation of working-class dreamers and middle-class merchants. For decades after the crash, families who had lost everything passed down a bitter, cautionary tale about the dangers of invisible wealth and the predatory nature of the financial elite. The trauma of 1720 left a permanent scar on the national psyche, transforming a society of hopeful investors into a deeply cynical population that would forever view the promises of the stock market with deep, lingering suspicion. The shockwave of 1720 extended far beyond the ruined estates of London, fundamentally altering the global understanding of wealth and trust. For the first time, the public realized that a company endorsed by the Crown and backed by the government could still be a hollow shell. The blind faith in state-sponsored monopolies was permanently broken, forcing a drastic shift in how empires would finance their ambitions. When the Bank of England finally intervened to stabilize the crumbling economy, it cemented a new, chilling reality. The state was no longer just a partner in trade, but the ultimate, desperate safety net for a system built on fragile promises. This catastrophic collapse forged the modern financial world in the fires of profound betrayal. The ledgers of the South Sea Company became a grim blueprint, proving that human greed, when amplified by complex debt and political corruption, could threaten the very stability of a nation. The assumption that markets were rational or inherently safe was destroyed, replaced by a lingering dread that still haunts trading floors centuries later. Every regulation, every financial safeguard enacted in the decades that followed, was born directly from the ashes of those burned by the bubble. The crisis proved that the most dangerous threats to an empire rarely come from foreign armies, but from the quiet stroke of a pen on a corrupted balance sheet. Today, deep within the silent archives of London, the original ledgers of the South Sea Company still exist. Their fading ink holds the names of the desperate, the greedy, and the ruined, frozen forever at the exact moment their world collapsed. Those brittle pages remain as a haunting monument to the devastating cost of illusion, a quiet reminder that the darkest chapters of human history are sometimes written not in blood, but in numbers.